Hello, everybody. It's me, it's Ian. Welcome back to Introduction to Folklore. And this time we're talking about ballad and folk song. And it raises a couple of interesting questions. And the first is, well, what is a song? What is this thing? And sometimes that seems like a self-evident question, but I mean, we have to kind of ask ourselves, considering that we live in the 21st century and we have exposure to a certain kind of songs, are we talking about a thing that is comprised of lyrics that are typically metrical, and that are applied to some kind of melody and then it is intended for performance? Or are we talking about the finished product of those things as they actually are substantiated, or rather instanced in some kind of live event? So I mean, we can distinguish something like I'm just sort of trying to come up with a good example. Like Bohemian Rhapsody is a song, but really it reaches its pinnacle in its recorded version, and it is difficult to reproduce in other contexts. But if you take something like the Canadian National Anthem, well, there really isn't a definitive version. There isn't a standard version of it. It is something that is announced. Now, national anthem is not necessarily, well, that's an interesting question whether we should call the national anthem a folk song or not, because it's something that can be done spontaneously. It's something that we all have access to. It's something that we might do on a regular basis, but it differs in large part because it isn't subject to a huge amount of variation. It isn't subject to radical interpretation, and usually it's only held for sort of sacred events, or semi-sacred events like what would they call it? Sort of state religious events, or yeah. Anyway, digress. That was a strange tangent. So, but the question is, well, what is a song? And then once we ask that question, what is a song? We ask the next question about what is a folk song, because we do sort of differentiate these things. I mean, what does the adjectival folk add to the concept of song to make a folk song something that is distinct from this broader category of song? And one of the things is that the issue of a folk song is typically, folk song has been studied by folklorists for so very long. It's one of the it's one of those major areas of research that has been investigated. So it's been so it's sort of like lodged in the canon for a while. And one of the things that is about folks, one of the things to think about in terms of folk song is that it does seem to be something that has, like folk narrative, it's something that's lost its creation, it lost its connection to any kind of initial maker. Now we can imagine that at one point someone didn't sit down and write, because that's already imposing a 21st century idea on how composition takes place, but that someone created a earlier version of this song, and then it entered into, through repetition, through the fact that it is reperformed, it entered into something approaching a recognizable type, a recognizable form with more or less standardized lyrics and more or less standardized order of verses and so on, and then variation occurred afterwards. But basically it is something like all folk stuff, it is not so much its performance as its reperformance. It continues to be found important, it continues to be found relevant, and it is subject to variation, and it has this sense of kind of communal ownership, that this is our song. This isn't simply this isn't a song that has been passed down which retains its connection to a specific maker or a specific event. Folk songs can travel. One of the major areas of folk song study, and one of the classic works, is Francis James Child's Ballads of the English, no, not Ballads of the Scottish Borders, the English and Scottish Popular Ballads. I think that's the name of the work. He had an earlier work, but then his major work is the English and Scottish Popular Ballads. And what he did is he was interested in ballad. Now, ballad is a subset of folk song in that it's narrative. Typically, it tells a story, as opposed to a lyric, and a lyric is more or less descriptive, either of a place or of an emotion or of a feeling or of a comely lass or whatever, but ballads have these narrative aspects to them, and that's kind of important because we also have, within that category we have historical ballads, and so historical ballads actually become a really interesting source of some historical data. So there has been work on how ballads maintain a certain amount of ballads can be used as a data source for certain things. And David Buchan has this really great classic article on the Battle of Harlaw, which is a child ballad. I'm going to get back to child ballads in a second, but how the Battle of Harlaw actually contains this information that is that is actually historically accurate and relevant. If you really dig into the history, you'll find that the Battle of Harlaw ballad maintains certain aspects, a certain perspective on the events that don't seem to match up with the generally accepted history. But then, like, historians are like, wait a second, and Battle of Harlaw is actually pretty on point. So the historical record is actually sometimes maintained in ballads in that way, in the historical ballads. But taking a step back. So the idea of the child ballads, and we call them child ballads after Francis James Child, not because they are associated with children, but that they were basically these forms of poetry that are retained. And he collected, I think the number is something like 305 different ballads with different texts associated with them, each of which had a number of variations. And so he would number them, child ballad 1 through 305, and then child ballad 186 had 186A and B and C and D, and A was what he thought sort of the most definitive version, and then B through whatever letter he went to were lesser versions, but still of sort of historical interest. But he was very much in this 19th century mindset. He was, first of all, he was concerned with the ballad as a text, as words, as verse, and not necessarily as song. Even though he recognized that they were sung, he was interested in them as literary forms. And that is something that is always kind of on the cusp, because and he was also he was clearly interested in the oldest form he could possibly find. He was of that mindset that thought that oldest was most authentic, that variations were a sign of decay, even though he could recognize interesting historical variation and historically relevant variation. He thought that was still nevertheless a lesser version, a lesser form of whatever particular child ballad he had. And so folk song is a really interesting dynamic into the study of folklore to begin with, because when you're collecting song, he was using archival texts. He was basically going through and finding, and he had a whole network of people. He was actually, I don't know if he was born in America, but he was rooted in America. He was the first person to hold a chair in English at Harvard, and his stuff was folk song. It was folk ballad. They had a whole network of collaborators, and they would scour archival sources. So in terms of that old form, he was interested in what was written down. Reluctantly, he would occasionally confer with people who had collected versions in the field. And but oldest better. That was his mantra, more or less. And but in the 19th century, before you had recording equipment, how else would you record a song? You would maybe be able to sit there and write it out as it is being performed. More likely, you would have to find someone who sings it and have them sing it for you piecemeal. Like, sing that first line, let me write it down. Sing the next line, let me write it down. So they weren't happening in performances. And they weren't happening in performances, they weren't happening sort of live and spontaneous. And so they were they were very much text. And again, partially indifferent to how they were sung if you're really only interested in text. If you're really interested in them as sort of, in that sort of, spirit of the folk aspect, that herder aspect of like there's eternal truths of an ancient time that are retained in these words, that kind of idea. But But what happened is that eventually recording equipment became available, and eventually recording equipment, and more importantly, recording media became less and less rare, or less and less precious. And so you could go and you could hear, you could record people as they performed. And the first thing is that you could record them and pay attention to their performance. And you could go, oh, okay. So all of a sudden, these things, the performance isn't simply this arbitrary means by which we get to this text. The performance is a lived thing. And one of the things that allowed, when you're not busily, their head down on your scratch pad trying to get words down as someone is singing them, or worse, interrupting them so that you can, so that they are set to your pace, and you're just like, I'm going to let this person perform. All of a sudden, you get a different set. Now, there's still sort of a variation, because the old recorders, the original phonograph recorders, where you would go directly onto a wax cylinder or a wax disc, without the benefit of any kind of magnetic microphone. Basically, if you know those old sort of logos of like a Victrola record player, and so those big funnels that act as the speakers, that would also act as the microphone. So you would basically be they would have someone sort of more or less sing into this cone, which is not a natural context for performance. And then microphones emerged, and then you were able to get something more and more natural, more and more akin to it. So all of a sudden you can think of it, okay, it is both the music, but it is both the words, but the melody is important, the speed on which it's sung, the tone, the key. I mean, you start to bring a musicological approach to it as well. And then, if you have the ability, and this took time to have the ability, because it took time for the media to be so available that you could spare multiple versions, you could hear someone perform it again and again. Or you could do this, I go back to the old field recordings of someone who collected from this person 5 years ago, and you see how they change, and all of a sudden you recognize that they are not changing it because they are performing it badly. They are changing it because it is important for them to change it at that time. And all of a sudden, how many times have I used all of a sudden in this video already? I don't know. But now you get that grasp of things exist in performance, and you get that shift to, I shouldn't be looking at these as items, I should be looking at these as performances. And that's an important step as well, because one of the things that was really interesting it's been an interesting question for several centuries, really, is thinking back, again, thinking of poetry, but thinking back to Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how these epic poems, how were they remembered? That's a fascinating question. Before they were written down, how were these bardic poems remembered? How does someone sit down and remember a 20,000 line poem? Especially if you're talking about a culture that doesn't have the opportunity to write this thing down. If it's a non-literate culture, how do you remember a poem that long? And it's sort of one of the, they must have just been inheriting some kind of remarkable spirit, supernatural, practically supernatural gifts. And then in the 20th century, with the benefit of recording equipment, Albert Lord, who's the other guy? I'll write it down. Milman Parry and Albert Lord. Milman Parry and Albert Lord. They went to Macedonia. Macedonia is northern Greece, and basically it's the same place geographically where Homer was. And there were still people in Macedonia who were still sitting in the town square, and they were still performing epic poetry. And that happens to this day. This just happened to be their site. And so it's like, well, let's go to the place where Homer was and see how this happens. And they recorded, and they paid attention, and they came up with this idea of oral formulaic theory, the notion of basically spontaneous composition, where the people understand the plot, and they have a set of formulas that they are able to reconstruct as they go. And so it is not that they memorize so much as they are able to spontaneously recreate spontaneously compose, because if they have one idea, and importantly, they have one metric condition in which to express that idea, they only have one formula that fits that. So, just to use the example from blues music, which has also been parsed through oral formulaic theory. Like the you might think of blues as often having a lot of sort of standard tropes, like I've got a kind-hearted woman, and you say, I mean, because of the metrical conditions of the 12-bar blues formula, I've got a kind-hearted woman fits, and it expresses that. Or you could say I got a mean spirit, mean-hearted woman, cold-hearted woman's probably the one you would go with. But you just have a very narrow range so that you can spontaneously perform and spontaneously create. So we're talking about how things pass down. We're also talking about how things are, and so that's the performer angle. And then it's like one of the reasons that they perform it is because it continues to have resonance within the group. It continues to be important. It continues to have a place. And so those are the aspects. But it's different from, we can grasp that it is different from pop culture, and we can grasp that it's different from elite culture. At the very least, we can grasp it because we exist in a world that we categorize these things. So it's good to take a step back and think about pop culture, elite culture, and folk culture and how they might operate. So when we think about folk, popular, and elite cultures, we do tend to distinguish them as some kind of absolute, as if they are invariant. But nevertheless, we see that they bleed through all the times. In part because folk songs can become popularized through recordings, and someone will take a traditional song and do something to it. And to be fair, and to remember the delicate history of folk song and folk song scholarship, because remember, one of the things that I said earlier is that the idea that sort of folk song isn't owned by anybody. It's communally maintained, which is a positive thing until you enter into the sticky world of copyright. Because if no one owns it, then I can just take it and do whatever the hell I want with it. And that's when you think of it as a song, and not necessarily as a song that nevertheless fits within the preserve of particular people. Because some people, as a folk song circulates, it doesn't circulate anonymously. Typically, there are practitioners within that community that add something to it. That it is not that there's always this interchange between the received text and how a particular person manifests it and develops a reputation for manifesting it. So, and those are the people who are often recorded by either unscrupulous recording companies in the early part of the 20th century, or by folklorists. Because they have a reputation for exemplary tradition bearers. But the idea that they have added something to it, that their variations are also a creative impulse and creative input, and they are fundamentally arrangers, as it were, is kind of glossed over. Like, you could just take a song, take someone else's recording, and just put traditional on it, and own the copyright and make money off of the copyright. And that's a very ugly history that to be fair, it's mostly record companies that have done that, but sometimes they have been doing it through the surreptitious plucking of actual folk song collectors. So it's something to be a little bit wary of. But one of the ways that we distinguish folk and popular and elite culture is how they are supported. And that folk culture is basically supported by the folk themselves. If there's an economic rationale for it, or an economic reason, or if there's a cost behind it, they will subsidize it. So, on a literal level, if you're having sort of like fundraiser suppers and so on, people will chip in money, and if there's an entertainer, they'll pay the entertainer. If you're having a barn dance or something, a hat will be passed around, and the person will be recompensed. But basically the idea is that the impetus for continuing this thing is solely within the preserve of the group itself. We do this, it's important to us, we will put our resources behind it. Popular culture is motivated by markets. It's typically on the very least, it's on a larger scale than the sort of prototypical folk group, and it is something that is created with a specific intent of being marketable, of something, and then this performance becomes much more a commodity than it is just simply a kind of a tit for tat exchange. And it becomes something that is lucrative. And then, because it is lucrative, one of the things that distinguishes the folk from the popular is the idea that you are trying to have it resonate with a larger and larger and larger group, because you want to take that commodity and make it something that is appealing to as many people as possible. You have the idea of narrow casting. We can talk about that, but we're not going to talk about that right now. For the most part, we're talking about the push towards a broad appeal. And the success of it is mediated by markets. If it doesn't work in the marketplace, it's not going to be supported by the marketplace. It's going to basically disappear. And that's often one of the interesting moments when it becomes subsumed again by the folk. Because if it's like, well, people aren't buying this particular version of this song, but I am singing this song in my local repertoires. I am singing this song at home. This song is important to me, and then all of a sudden it becomes subsumed into the sort of folk process. You see that when you read the Peter Narvaez reading on, I think I wrote a folk song about Ron Hines and Sonny's Dream, in that as a song, as his recording of that song, did okay. It was fine, but it has taken on this role in Atlantic Canada that is personal. I mean, it's personal and then becomes manifested in markets again, but it is fundamentally about the people themselves, the folk themselves. Elite culture is typically something that is supported through patronage. Basically, one of the reasons that I prefer the term elite culture is that, economic elites, as some kind of noblesse oblige, are typically the people who keep this thing running. That it wouldn't necessarily sustain itself on the level of folk culture, because it just doesn't have that sort of spontaneous urge, nor does it necessarily have the marketplace. But nevertheless, it is seen as sort of a fixed good, and therefore it needs to be subsidized. It needs to be supported because it is fundamentally a good thing. So you think of things like opera, for example. I mean, there is a marketplace for opera. It is too large an endeavor for the folk, as it were. And it's not to say that the folk can't appreciate it. It's just that they are not part of the economic engine that keeps opera afloat. Neither really are markets. It's typically through the subsidized, through charitable boards like the Ford Foundation or National Endowment for the Arts and so on, that opera companies are floated. They do sell tickets, but for the most part they wouldn't exist were it not for this top-down benefit. And you can think about that in terms of forms of literature as well. That we have like popular literature that really only exists in the marketplace, and then we have there's local producers of folk literature and small books and so on that are not much different from like chapbooks. And you could make an argument that sort of a lot of internet lore and internet writing is that, in that it is, it's not there for an economic reason. It's there to be contributions to the group's overarching literary form. So like slash fiction or fan fiction is basically folk literature in its purest sense, in terms of it being a written thing, but also for no other reason than for the pure enjoyment of doing it, not for commercial success, and certainly not to be subsidized by the state. And then you have things like the books that enter into some kind of de facto canon and are substantiated by, not by opera companies, but by like universities and so on. So it is important for you to know Shakespeare. So even though, Shakespearean companies can more or less sustain themselves, but the books are in print in part because they are always the books are in print because someone has said these books need to be in print. The New Canadian Library, that long series that McClellan and Stewart did and still does on sort of the great works of Canadian literature, they are there because their sort of commercial life might have expired, but it's like, no, we need to keep these going, and these are fixed forms, and so this sort of subsidized form of literature. But we're talking about song, and so you kind of have it's good to think of those things, of how they are subsidized, how they are supported, who supports them. There's often sort of an aesthetic associated with them, and that popular music, we can sort of think about, flashy instrumentation, that the newest thing, that genres emerge, instruments are fine. Folk has an aesthetic towards it, or often the understanding of an aesthetic. That is not an absolute by any stretch of the imagination, and you can put a lot of remix culture within folk culture as opposed to within popular. But the sobriquet folk music often implies some kind of aesthetic of acousticity, for example, and unadornedness, and so on. And in elite music, basically, sort of in a way, the scale of it is one of the things that sort of haunts it. Another way of distinguishing them is the sort of the permanence of the performance. I mean, a folk performance, and even the heart of folklore theory is that a folk performance is an ephemeral moment. It exists in like sort of one instance, and then it kind of dissipates, and the next performance of it is a new event in and of itself. So we sort of talk about these various instances, but they are separate. Popular typically becomes mediated, committed to some kind of medium, but a medium that is supported through the marketplace. Elite is sometimes sort of on the cusp, because we're often talking about these sort of grand scale events like symphony performances or opera performances and so on. So they don't have the sort of the spontaneity of performance that a theoretical folk performance has, but nevertheless they are about spectacle. And one of the things that makes them about spectacle is another way of thinking of the sort of the distinction between the performer and the audience in folk, in folk and popular and elite culture. And then in folk culture, the distinction, at least in sort of the model, is that it's notional. It's that basically of this group, someone has momentarily taken the stage, literally or figuratively, and is performing something that is of the group's immediate set of expectations. It might be a novel thing, but it is fitting those expectations, and it is built on an awareness of those expectations. And the person might have a reputation for this kind of performance, but they also are part of the group and have deep social ties with everyone else in the group. And so they will then sort of at the end of performance, they kind of more or less blend back into the group itself. Popular culture, a kind of a different sort of distinction between performer and audience, and that this is a specialized practitioner, and often they are working towards a different understanding of audience, because not only do they need to appeal to the aesthetics of this group, but they need to appeal to the aesthetics of a larger and larger group as they try and build a professional career of their performances that are substantiated by markets and not simply by the largesse of the people that they are performing to, in terms of like sort of a pass the hat situation. So they are specialized practitioners, and they are understanding of model. It doesn't mean that their art is bad. It doesn't mean that their art is good. It means that their art is fulfilling a sort of a different niche. Finally, you have like the sort of the distinction between the elite. And again, if you're thinking about it in terms of patronage, the artist is very much a different thing. It is a flow through. The notion that these are sort of eternal works that need to be supported through noblesse oblige. That is that nevertheless sort of takes the performer and turns it into sort of a special category of someone who is appealing to those sort of senses of aesthetics. But they are a specialized practitioner. They might be honored, and it is not that they are like the modern equivalent of like a court jester or something, dancing for the wealthy, but they are the distinction is very much absolute, in part because, as I said, these are often in the form of like spectacle. They are specialized spaces, and the distinction between those who watch and those who perform is basically sort of absolute. You can think about like sort of the hall, the theater, the scale of it. They are doing something that is spectacular, is beyond the possible ken of the people who are present to it, but it would only exist because of the presence and the patronage of the people who are present to it. If you think of something like, I mean, skipping again, not talking about song for a second. If you think about it like forms of architecture, you have like vernacular architecture where, you know, it's based on intelligence. There's local practitioners who have an understanding of it, but basically they will get together and they will build according to a sense of aesthetic and practicality and understanding of engineering that might not be able to be communicated by them into the level of academic engineering language, but nevertheless fulfill those qualities. So the house, as it is understood in Atlantic Canada prior to the age of standardization. And then you have things like mass-produced housing, which is still, you know, it can be nice, it can be aesthetically pleasing, and it can also be adapted to a certain extent to a local aesthetic. But it is manufactured, it's there to be cost-effective, and it has those sort of considerations as well. And you can sort of see that this isn't simply going to be, you know, Kent Homes doesn't do it for one community. They do it for as much of Atlantic Canada as they possibly can. And then you have like elite architecture, things that are one of a kind, that are, you know, no individual or no regular person could potentially subsidize and create it. It is also meant to be a one of a kind object in and of itself. So that these are distinct moments. So, you know, elite architecture in that way. But again, there is fluidity because we can be influenced one way or another. One of the other things to consider when we're talking about song is the fact that song, going back to the thing that I was almost complaining about earlier, and this idea of songs being something that are of the people who are really interested in the older forms and the older forms and the older forms. And then blowing up that idea, and that song is a perfect example of something that is perhaps based on precedent, but is made new in each and every performance. And even if the aesthetic is, no, this is how it used to be, it is subject to a certain amount of variation. But there are these structures in place. So one of the fascinating things about song is that you can detect a time depth in it because it has metricality. Unlike folk narrative, which is for the most part, now I'm going to start confusing things, so let me begin again. Unlike much of what folklore study as folk narrative, which is myth, which is legend, which is tale, that is performed, as it were, for the most part in prose. And prose doesn't have metrical conditions. So if you have plot point, plot point, plot point, plot point, plot point, you can basically say things however you want. You're immediately going to throw in the idea that every now and then there's a tale that has one or two fixed formulas, and that's fine. You have like a fee, fi, fo, fum that needs to be in there. So don't come at me. There are variations of that. Little pig, let me in, not by the hair of my chin, chin, chin. So there are these formulas that repeat, but everything between those formulas is much more fluid. But verse is in metrical conditions. And because verse is in metrical conditions, it has that much more of a rigid structure. It typically needs to rhyme, so that's going to limit the words that you use, and it typically needs to fit a rhythm. So there is this additional level of model and expectation that needs to be conformed to, because from version to version, the song is going to be more or less is going to not simply meet the expectations of the theme and the plot or whatever. It's going to need to meet the expectations of the rhythms and the rhymes that this entails. So that does become an additional aide de mémoire. The rhythm and rhyme become these moments that help keep these things. So when we come across song, we are more likely to have it. Song is less subject to variation than narrative. That's basically it, because it has these things. So song does become this opportunity to just see a little bit more of that sense of time depth. And even though I've been stressing that time depth is not a marker of authenticity, it is still cool when you think of something that does have that resonance. So each and every time something is performed, not simply, again, with a song as opposed to a story, or with a poem as opposed to prose, every time it is performed, it not only has the expectations of semantic content in terms of the meaning that is being expressed in this thing, it has the expectations of the verbal forms in which that semantic content is expressed. And it is cool when you get just that level of additional time depth. So as much as these things are subject to variation, and we cannot forget that they are subject to variation, and we cannot insist that variation is anything other than a dynamic, fascinating, creative, informed process that keeps traditions alive, as opposed to an evidence of a tradition in decline, it is not incommensurate with that thought to also think, yeah, but it's kind of cool when you hear an old thing and you know that thing hasn't changed much. And maybe hasn't changed much is not really a substantial thing upon which to hang a discipline, but, or at least a disciplinary perspective, but that just sort of kind of cool. But the thing that's most important to remember about the study of folk song is that idea that the song, irrespective of where it comes from, whether it is something that is of your community, of your place, and has been sung for generations, or it is something that is only a couple of years old, maybe only a couple of years old, you want to be sort of figuring out what is your group's repertoire? What are the texts that are meaningful for your group? And recognizing, of course, that you belong to multiple groups. So if you think about what comprises your canon of, let's just use a lowercase f for folk song, not this sort of official idea of something that has long time depth and grand attestation within your group and all those sort of cliches, but something that is important to you, to your family as one of the folk groups. And you might have songs that were sung, that were popular songs, but were sung to you as a child, and have basically, you find meaning in those. And they become part of your group's, your family's repertoire. If you're one of those families that gets together and sing, just think about the kind of songs that are sung, the songs that basically everyone goes, oh, and starts singing along together. The same thing with your peer group, songs that have entered into it, and you sing along to it. If you remember when Gord Downey was dying, and how things like Ahead by a Century and Bob Cajun, all of a sudden they started to eclipse Tragically Hip, and just like, no, these are like new Canadian anthems. And yes, it's not that we have forgotten. This isn't this classic idea of folk song where the original author has been forgotten. No, they are remembered, but it is almost irrelevant, because it is about how that song has found purchase within a group as a conveyor of meaning, of a conveyor of that symbolic, semantic content that I was just talking about. This expresses something about how we operate in the world, and so we will re-perform it. And we'll re-perform it maybe in the way of we will just replay that version, or we will learn it, or we will sing it around the campfire, or. But it becomes something that is not simply present. It becomes something more than we have purchased this thing from iTunes to this is who we are. This is part of who I am. And once you go over the divide and you think about the role that these things have. They are aesthetic patterns of semantic meaning that are embodied. One of the things about a song is that it announces itself. You know that you are engaged in something artistic, or you are witness to something artistic when something is being sung, because it is not it's a different register of performance. Once you are singing, people know that you are singing. It's not like a story where you can all of a sudden say, "Oh wait, this guy's telling a story," and they've done a sort of Del Heimsian breakthrough into performance. Once you go, everyone knows, okay, a performance is happening, and so they announce themselves. They're intextual. You can sort of take them out. They can pluck them. They have a certain integrity to them as units, and yet what is important about them is not their integrity as units. It is the idea that they have a place within the folk group. I think there's a sort of weird fisheye thing. Ooh, this is fun. The song has meaning. The song has purpose within the group. That might not be an eternal purpose. It might just be at this particular moment. But you might want to think of the songs that have just a little bit more time, that they have lasted within the group. Even if you can point exactly when they emerged, there's something about them. And there's something about them that is evocative of place, is evocative of purpose, and says something about you. And the question of the week is, identify one of those songs. A song, whether it is a capital F folk song, because it can be, of course, or whether it is a popular song that nevertheless has taken over. What is a song that is fundamentally important to your group? And describe the song, or describe the settings in which it might be performed. Maybe and say why. And what is that group? I mean, is it a family song? Is it a friendship group song? Is it a workplace song? What? By this time, you kind of know the kind of ways that I'm looking for questions to be answered. Anyway, I'm good. I'm done. Be well, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye. So going to edit that part.